Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of our Tech Tuesday webinar series. My name is Kevin Marheine, and I am the host of the series here. Joining me today is Chris Shalda. He is our Senior Solutions Architect, and he will be walking us through the presentation he's prepared in just a moment. But a couple of very quick housekeeping items. Today's presentation is going to be very heavy in terms of the amount of information that Chris will be going through. So we will still be taking questions, but usually we reserve Q&A time at the end of the presentation to sort of address those live. We will actually reach out directly to you with those answers. So please feel free to submit them through the chat, but we will reach out via email to answer any questions you do have, because there's a lot of material here. We will also be sending out the recording and the slide deck from today's presentation, so you'll be able to refer back to those. And then this is also going to be the final webinar that we are hosting through GoToWebinar. Moving forward, we will be moving to Teams live events. We did a webinar there last week using that platform, and it worked out rather well. So we are going to be switching over full time to leveraging the Microsoft platform. And without any further ado, Chris, I will go ahead and turn it over to you, because I know there's a lot of great material you've prepared for today.
All right, great. Thanks, Kevin. Hey, thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, lots to cover today. And as you can see, the kind of presentation here is going to be on all the government cloud options that Microsoft has to offer. And what really is why I'm doing this is because we work with a lot of customers that are kind of government contractors, or they're SaaS providers for the government kind of agencies. And this gets very confusing when you're trying to determine whether you're going to be on commercial, you're going to be on Gov. What's this GCC versus GCC High? And it doesn't line up very clearly, let's just say. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of, what are the different options, how they line up, how do they interact with each other at a high level. And at the same time, I'm going to try to help you understand. I guess I go to the agenda here. What the compliance considerations are of even choosing the right one at that point too. So I'm going to get into that, talk about what some of the collaboration considerations are too, because there are some nuances. I think everything you're going to see here has some nuances, but I'm going to try to be as clear as possible. And of course, like Kevin said, feel free to send out any questions in the chat. We'll get back to you later, and I have some contact information at the end as well, if you feel more comfortable sending it that way. Before we get started, just to let you know, we will be hosting this up on our YouTube channel at Coretek Services, and where we also keep all the rest of our Tech Tuesday webinar series. I encourage you to subscribe to our channel and also hit the bell to be able to get notified when we put out new content, because we are pretty consistently doing about every week, putting on a new webinar. So looking to keep that up, and hopefully future ones will be valuable to you as well. So before we get started, disclaimers and whatnot, right? I won't be covering every single scenario, compliance requirement, licensing option today. Definitely get with your Microsoft account rep, go to the official Microsoft docs for guidance, as well as, any of the regulatory compliance guidelines that are out there for, what you have to cover for that. And most of these considerations today, as I kind of already mentioned, refer to government contractors, subcontractors, SaaS providers to the US government or the US government agencies, not necessarily directly like you are a government agency or you work for the government directly. There are those are usually pretty cut and dry of what you have to do for some of these options, and usually it's already decided for you. It's really becomes a little bit tricky when you're trying to sell something to the government or provide a service to the government, where things get a little tricky, and that's where I'm going to try to decipher that for you today. We're going to be covering the most popular US government-related compliance requirements, not necessarily all of them. There's quite a bit, and some of them are a little bit more niche than others, so I'm trying to cover at least the most popular ones. You're going to see references potentially Microsoft 365 government versus Office 365 government. It's in general, like, Microsoft 365 is a superset of Office 365. So everything in Office 365 is part of Microsoft 365, but there's still some documentation places where you're going to see Microsoft 365 government, and then you're also going to see Office 365 government. It kind of means the same thing. And that's going to, and at the same time, it may not mean GCC or GCC High specifically. It might mean both, or including the DoD. So just look for the qualifiers of GCC, GCC High, or DoD for those. And then, and lastly, I'm not really going to be covering the Office 365 DoD, Azure DoD, or Azure Secret today, because those ones are really specifically, like kind of mentioned, those are like for the government entities themselves. And essentially, Office 365 DoD is just like a copy of GCC High, but like I said, it's exclusive for the U.S. Department of Defense itself. So let's jump right in here. So I want to help you visually understand some of the nuances of these different government clouds. So let's start with defining this. Hopefully this will kind of help you visualize this. What I've done here is on the left side, I'm breaking up left and right the different circles in terms of which Azure Active Directory environments these are in. So you'll see on the left side, Azure AD Commercial, that's the global Azure Active Directory that's available everywhere. And as you can see, I have it in blue there. The entire thing is, it's global data centers, right? Besides, you'll see, I'll talk about the GCC in a second, but Azure AD as a whole is across all the globe and all the data centers across the world from Microsoft. And same thing with Microsoft 365 Commercial and Azure Commercial, those are in data centers across the world. Now, when I say CONUS data centers, as it's mentioned on the bottom there in orange, CONUS is just it's a fun term if you're not familiar. It's the continental US, right? So not including, whatever, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, whatever, right? But continental US, meaning that these data centers reside in the US. So what you see is interesting is that even though Microsoft 365 GCC, which by the way means Government Community Cloud, those servers are running out of the Azure AD Commercial directory. However, they're run on servers that are only in the US. So all the data are only in the US for the GCC side, but still kind of integrates with Azure AD Commercial. And there's some interesting nuances in terms of what compliance offerings you're allowed to that are covered in the GCC side of it, which I'll show you a little later in more detail, but just keep that in mind, right? And on the right side, so Azure AD Gov, so there's another Azure Active Directory. This is like a completely different cloud. Think of this as like a completely different Active Directory forest, and they don't talk to each other. There's no trust between them or anything. That's completely separate. So if you have a user in one directory on, Azure AD Commercial, you have a user on Azure AD Gov, they're not in the same directory. So there's going to be some nuances there in terms of sharing and collaboration. We'll get into that later as well. But the key thing is that Azure AD Gov is a directory for Microsoft 365 GCC High, as well as Azure Government, okay? And at the same time, since those are in orange, those two also only reside, all the data only resides within continental US, which is important for a number of compliance requirements, okay? Now, before we get too much further on, just know that GCC High, in terms of service availability, there are some feature nuances. This also kind of applies to Azure Government as well. They're trying to get parity, right? But there are some additional measures that have to be taken to ensure the compliance. So it's a little bit behind in some ways. But for the most part, GCC High, you do have the core Exchange Online, SharePoint, Skype for Business Teams types features. There's just, certain things that there are a few nuances there. So you're going to want to definitely check that out before you decide on any purchases or licenses there. Just a heads up. And Azure from Azure Government, same idea in terms of they're getting there close in terms of parity wise, but it's just not 100% there with Azure Commercial. So let's get into compliance considerations. So this is I don't even know. I think I tried to be as comprehensive as possible. I think there's still a couple more on there that are related compliance offerings related to U.S. government that even Microsoft provides. So this is just kind of an overview of just, look, there's a lot, right? Now, every single one is like each customer that works with a government agency or is a contractor there is not necessarily going to need to be have to be covered by all of these compliance offerings. It would be probably pretty rare. So it's going to be some subset here. So it's going to depend on your business and what you need and what you're bound by, right? But I wanted to kind of give an overview here to help everybody out as much as possible. And I'm going to get into a little more detail with each of those. The other thing to mention when we're talking about compliance is that anything in the cloud, it's a shared responsibility model, right? So what that means is that the shared responsibility, when we're talking about Microsoft cloud offerings, whether that's commercial or government, it doesn't matter. There's some things that Microsoft is responsible for, and they are guaranteeing that they're going to do for you, and they have third-party auditors come in and making sure they're doing what they're saying they're going to be doing. And then there's certain things that you as a customer of Microsoft is required to do and is your responsibility in order to meet certain, especially compliance requirements. So what you'll see here is in the blue, these blue kind of squares and triangles here are what you would be responsible for in the different models. All the way to the right on-prem, as you know, if you're on-prem, you have to do everything yourself, right? Microsoft's not helping you with that stuff because it's all on-prem, it's in your data centers. When you go to IaaS, infrastructure as a service for Azure, Microsoft takes care a little bit more for you. When you go to start using PaaS services, Microsoft takes care more for you. And then you get to SaaS, that's when you get into Microsoft 365 type services. Microsoft's taking care of even more for you. So keep this in mind when we're talking about compliance-wise, is this can accelerate your compliance accreditations, your ATOs, and also it's just less time, right? Because a lot of this is already pretty kind of certified by Microsoft, where you can just kind of hand that to the auditors. Yep, it's on SaaS with Microsoft. Oh yeah, we're good. These things are covered. This is a smaller list here that you guys have to, as a customer, take care of. Okay. So let's get in a little more specifically into GCC and GCC High. So the GCC, so the Government Community Cloud, that was created to meet the unique and evolving requirements of the United States federal, state, local, and tribal governments, as well as those contractors for those governments holding or processing data on behalf of the US government. And the GCC High was created to meet the unique and evolving requirements of the United States Department of Defense, as well as contractors holding or processing DoD-controlled unclassified information, so like CUI, or subject to international traffic in arms regulations, ITAR. And Microsoft does offer GCC High and DoD environments. I'm just not showing the DoD, we're not kind of showcasing that today. But the GCC High is essentially a copy of the DoD environment. It's just physically separated and intended for DoD contractors, while the Office 365 DoD is intended for the actual United States Department of Defense, not the contractors, and does have a slightly higher DoD SRG impact level. So I'm going to kind of go through here line by line to kind of help you understand what this means here. And so as you see, we have Microsoft 365 Commercial on the left side, GCC in the middle, GCC High on the right. And basically, the first two lines kind of already covered today about where these data center locations are, who's eligible here. I have a little bit more detail on eligibility later on. Accreditation. So Microsoft 365 Commercial is essentially FedRAMP moderate. Equivalency in terms of that accreditation, Microsoft's not gonna give you any sort of direct documentation that's gonna prove that for you. So if you do need FedRAMP moderate, it's like Microsoft follows all the FedRAMP moderate kind of rules, but they don't accredit that. So if you need FedRAMP moderate specifically and not high, right, that would be a reason why you go to GCC. If you do need FedRAMP high, you need to go to GCC High. So you're going to kind of see how this works. It's going to be kind of least common denominator of what are the things that you need, kind of select the different rows, and then you're going to see, can I do GCC potentially, or do I have to be GCC High because of what I'm doing? One of the interesting ones here is FBI CJIS information. So this CJIS is the criminal justice information system. So that is really intended for state and local government entities, such as highway patrol, sheriff, local law enforcement, and that policy provides 13 areas that should be evaluated to determine if cloud services can be used and are consistent with the CJIS requirements. And these do correspond closely to the NIST 853 control implementation of FedRAMP moderate. And Microsoft has assessed these operational policies and procedures of Microsoft Azure Government and Office 365 Government, and they will attest to this in GCC. But since GCC High is more for federal side, the CJIS doesn't really apply because it's more of a state local government type thing. So if you need specifically CJIS, you're going to need to go with GCC. Now the rest of these will kind of show it will increase in terms of compliance capabilities as you go kind of up the list here. That was the only one that's a little bit strange. Now DFAR 7012 and other federal regulations, those do require organization to provide full reporting capabilities in the event of an incident or cyber attack or event. Microsoft supports this requirement in GCC High only. This liability in SLA does come to an expense to a cloud provider. That's why the costs are a little bit higher with GCC High. So just know that, if you truly have to account for 7012 DFARS, you probably need GCC High. There is some capabilities of DFARS in GCC, but there's no flow downs for that. And the reason why is because Microsoft did not build GCC nor commercial, right, for the purpose of DFARS. So if you'll not get a contractual agreement from Microsoft to support DFARS in GCC, nor to demonstrate DFARS compliance with your customers, vendors, and partners. So if you need full DFARS, you probably need GCC High at that point. For CUI and CDI, so that's the control and classified information, right? That there is a maybe there in terms of GCC because it may not cover every instance of CUI. There's different industries out there and very specifics there. So you may be in an industry where that is covered in GCC, but there's a good possibility that you're not going to be covered in GCC. GCC High will cover you for everything CUI, CDI. Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking about ITAR. Yeah, meant to talk about ITAR is what I meant to talk about. CUI, yeah. But yeah, ITAR, that is very close to kind of DFARS, where if you do need to have full kind of coverage there, that is really intended for GCC High, as there's like everything to do with GCC High is only in the US. There's no shared services or anything like that like GCC. And then, yeah, there's just additional kind of protections in place Microsoft has. All right, so I'm going to go to SRG level here. So the DoD security requirements guide, basically you don't get anything in commercial. In GCC, you do get a level 2 provisional authorization there. In GCC High, I believe it's actually a recent improvement here. It was level 4, is now level 5 that you can get with GCC High. Now we get to the NISTs. Different options here. You're going to see a couple maybes for 800-171. This is really because some of these aspects are available of 800-171 for the most part, but if you're a defense industrial based kind of contractor and working with the Department of Defense, then most likely not, because I mean DFARS does mandate the implementation of 800-171 and federal moderate impact level for commercial clouds, but it's really intended to be GCC High if you're going to need to go DFARS, which means you're already 800-171. So it's a little bit of a gray area that does have to be looked into a little bit deeper there. This 853, really this comes down to kind of, that's how FedRAMP moderate is built out, is 853 from NIST. And so that is kind of covered across the board. There are some little things about the organizational defined values. They may vary with GCC and GCC High, but for the most part, you should be covered for 853. And for NERC and FERC, that's the same idea, kind of goes up as you go. This is not, I don't see this as often here, so I don't have as much information in here, but GCC High will be definitely GCC, you may be covered for that. And lastly, from a customer support perspective, commercial and GCC are worldwide commercial personnel, where GCC High is only US based, very restricted personnel, all background checks on that. And then the directory networks like we mentioned before, okay? Now, another thing that comes up is CMMC. That is something that is a little bit newer that's coming out, that's basically, I want to say, superseding DFARS in a lot of ways, where the DoD was kind of requiring DFARS but didn't really enforce it very much, and now they're coming out with CMMC. Now, GCC High is not necessarily required to meet CMMC at any level. There are 5 levels of that, but GCC High is the only version of Office 365 or M365 that meets the reporting requirements of DFARS 7012 found in paragraph C to G. So most likely, if you need CMMC, you'll need to have DFARS 7012, which means you're going to have to do GCC High. And technically, the commercial and GCC versions of the platform can be configured to meet NIST 800-171, right? But the vast majority of the CMMC requirements, with those native products and capabilities. But we are finding that any organization, I mean, it's at least CMMC level 3, but usually you're shooting towards continuing to level 5. If you believe you have that requirement, you're probably going to need to go with a GCC High in most cases. But mileage may vary there, but that is just what we're seeing. Here's just a little bit graphic of kind of an idea. The shaded part is this is how some of this is so confusing. Each of those little circles is a different compliance framework, and the CMMC coverage is like a little bit of everything, right? Just like a subset of everything. So you do need to work with somebody that does understand that. Microsoft is providing a lot of great materials these days on that to help you guide through that process, and we've been helping a lot of customers with that as well. All right, compliance considerations on Azure Gov. So it's a little bit quicker here. This is same idea like I mentioned before on the CONUS and US type of locations. What's interesting is that Azure Commercial as well as Azure Gov are FedRAMP High accredited. So that is something to keep in mind there. That's a not super recent development on the Azure Commercial side, but that's something not as many people know about. For CGIS information though, that is specifically, you do have to go with Azure Gov for that, which is interesting because it is a different directory as GCC, Office 365 GCC, but that's the only place that Microsoft will kind of certify that to use. DFARS, again, Azure Gov, this is only in the US, so anything kind of DFARS is going to be very specific. DoD needs to be only in the US. ITAR, EAR, so this is what's interesting on the Azure Commercial side as well. You can get away with ITAR, EAR compliance. I have a little asterisk there because not all services, even in the Azure Gov, are ITAR, EAR compliant because there are some shared services that go kind of past the boundaries of the US. So you do need to check that list whether you do Azure Commercial or Azure Gov. DoD SRG level, and now Azure Gov is level 4, Azure Commercial is level 2 for that. Again, not all the services, so you have to check that list as well too. From a NIST perspective, again, check the list for the 800, 171, but 853, FedRAMP High is kind of pretty much is saying that you're going to meet that on both commercial and Azure Gov side. The other major difference here with Azure Gov is IRS 1075 type data. Again, check the services, not all of them apply, right? But that is going to be a requirement for Azure Gov. And very similar to the GCC side of things, where commercials, worldwide commercial personnel for support, Azure Gov is specific US-based restricted personnel with background checks and everything. And you see the difference of directories there, all right? So let's get a collaboration consideration. So because we're talking about different directories, like I said, they're not like trusted between each other. They don't even understand each other today. There seems to be some stuff on the roadmap that might change, but as of today, that's not the case. And beyond that, certain things like Azure US government, it just got B2B collaboration not too long ago. But the B2B collaboration is only supported between tenants that are both within the Azure US government, right? So Azure US Gov to Azure US Gov, that both are have the new B2B collaboration that's enabled. Because if you may still be on a legacy tenant that has to be migrated over, and Microsoft is ongoing working on that. I don't think they're 100% complete yet, but they're getting close, so that you can use B2B. That's something we've helped customers kind of, let's say, escalate if they needed that. So basically, if you're not on the B2B or you're outside the Azure Government Cloud, invitation will fail. All right, and then the last thing is B2B collaboration via Power BI is not supported. So there's some interesting gotchas there to be considering. I'm hoping that's going to change here soon. Microsoft 365 groups are not supported for B2B users and can't be enabled either from the Azure Government side and GCC High side yet. I'm hoping, again, they'll be here. So from a GCC High, this also applies to DoD. File sharing wise, you can share with other organizations within GCC High. And now you can share with non-GCC High email addresses attached to user profiles. Those are not supported, and they will not allow alert emails to be sent. So again, you kind of got to stay within your directory for that. And yeah, phone systems for Microsoft Teams, you do have to go with direct routing. You can't do any of the calling plans that are available otherwise in commercial or GCC. All right, so licensing options here. So, okay, you need to purchase Office 365 GCC or GCC High based off of your needs and your compliance requirements. So for GCC, what you're going to do is you can purchase that through a GCC certified, I meant to be LSP, I'm going to have to fix that, licensing service provider, AOSG provider, who's kind of usually services under 500 users in the government space, or CSP partners that are certified to sell GCC licensing. It's a little bit simpler process with that to get those licenses. GCC High, as are things that have a lot more requirements around compliance. There are a few other steps you have to take there, but how that works, it's a limited number of LSPs that are certified to do that for over 500 users, where you go through an EA. Under 500 users, you would work with one of the AOSG partners that are listed on the Microsoft website. They're honest, a lot more than there was only a few months ago. I think there was only like 6 before and a few months ago, and now I just looked and there's like 15. Like, wow, a lot of options. That's good. We work with a couple of the AOSG partners ourselves for our customer to kind of work as an intermediary there too. And to know about the GCC High, it is only annual payments models. You cannot do monthly for the licensing. That's just the way it is, so just be aware. With GCC, you still can do monthly, by the way. Typically, it is more expensive than on the commercial end of GCC licenses, again, because there's additional security measures, there's background checks, protections, and things happen behind the scenes. And not all security and compliance capabilities are available in GCC High yet. They are working on it. There is a good list on the service description page for Microsoft 365 about that. Just be aware that you buy them 365 E5 package, you think you're going to get everything in GCC High that you would in commercial. Not exactly. Still some parity issues there, but most of the stuff is there. They just have to look into the details. Just don't have time to cover that today. And GCC High, it was previously available only through an enterprise agreement, requiring 500 or more licenses. So what's new is that you can get it through the AOSG for under 500. And now it's available to anybody that needs to manage CUI, ITAR data, or have a CMMC clause in one of their contracts. So the eligibility requirements are not super high there. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail here, but there's some more eligibility information which you can find online as well. Just talking about the different kind of intents here of who is the Office 365 GCC or GCI is available for. And Microsoft did loosen these requirements in January 2021. That it can be any category of a type of customer that works for the government for GCC High licensing. Now for Azure Gov, right? First, you got to validate eligibility on that. And the best way to do that, if you don't already have an Azure Gov tenant, is just initiate a free trial that'll walk you through all the eligibility kind of things that you have to fill out for that. This again is basically any category. It's a category 1, 2, or 3 basically of a type of customer that they'll accept for this. You may have to provide some sort of contract information or something showing that you are working with a government entity potentially, but it's, from what I've heard, is that it's pretty straightforward if you do in fact qualify for it. And where you can purchase this is a little different, where you can basically purchase these Azure Gov subscriptions on that free trial tenant, right? So on that Azure Gov tenant, you add Azure Gov subscriptions. You can go through a CSP, like Coretek services. We're a CSP, a direct CSP, but we are authorized for the Azure Gov side. Not every CSP is, right? So that's one thing to note there for CSPs if you're working with those. You can go with an EA through a licensing service provider. Typically means you have 500 or more seats, or you can go pay as you go is another option there too. And so let's get down to, okay, now you gave me all this information, what do I choose? Commercial or Gov or GCC High? It really comes down to, you got to look through this information, start with your compliance requirements compared to your use case, and look at, are you going to be doing more productivity side where you need Office 365, and or do you need to be hosting some sort of SaaS applications potentially for the usage of government entities? It's going to have some data in there from the government entities in there. So that's where you're going to want to kind of understand your use cases and compare that both sides to whether you need to do one or both. a lot of times, especially on the GCC High side, you want to take a high watermark approach for your current and future business objectives. It is a lot more difficult to go from all of your, Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, everything in GCC to go to GCC High. You have to like rip it all out and redo it all and migrate. It's a pain. So if you're in an early stage here, especially if you have some CMMC requirements you believe you're going to have to meet, I would encourage you to probably consider GCC High, just as a little bit of a risk aversion to not have to move from a GCC to GCC High later, because it can be a little bit painful. We have helped some customers with that. Ideally, you don't have to go through that. And you start with GCC High if, kind of meet that criteria. Now, you also have to consider if you need to be in multiple of the Microsoft 365/Azure cloud types. You may need to, let's say you provide a SaaS application to some government customers as well as some commercial customers. Well, you can't put the commercial customer data in the government cloud, and you can't put the government cloud, government customer data in the commercial cloud. So you may need to have both. So 2 separate tenants on the Azure side, right? And one for commercial, one for Azure Gov for that SaaS application. At the same time, you may also need that from a productivity perspective, where you need to communicate with certain government entities, specifically using maybe a GCC High kind of like email system, let's just say, and SharePoint, and be able to do the B2B stuff with them, that, with the government entity that's on GCC High as well. But you have a portion of your business that's also kind of needs to be on the commercial side. So you might need to have 2 tenants, or sometimes one user may need to have logins on both tenants. There's a couple different logic gates there, but just be aware that it may not be just an all-in only Gov side or all-in commercial side. It may be a little bit of both based off of your needs. That's something that we definitely help a lot of customers think through the implications there and the best way to do that. I wanted to also include here some reference links, some short links around, there's some more information on understanding those compliance differences with the Microsoft 365 offerings, information on, what Microsoft has expanded the qualification for contractors for those government cloud offerings. And I did want to include some information that Microsoft's been posting out there about what they're doing around CMMC compliance in the Microsoft Cloud and how to accelerate your accreditation there. So that's really all I have today. So I really thank you for joining me. I went a couple minutes over here, but a lot of information to digest. It's okay. This stuff is not super straightforward. I do work with a lot of customers on these different areas. That's why I just have a different perspective here. Coretek is very happy to help. If you guys, any of you have any questions or just want to have a partner to help you along the way here and help guide you through it. We're not like a certifying body or an auditing, organization, but we can help you and guide you and kind of advise you at the very least, help accelerate your journey, making kind of the right decisions up front so that you don't get burned later. That's a major thing, kind of reduce that risk, if you will. But feel free to reach out to us on our website I got down there, or our kind of main email, or reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. Be happy to hear from you. Yeah, and hopefully I will see you next time on our next Tech Tuesday webinar. Kevin?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris. And yeah, just a couple minutes over here, so I won't keep us, but we will be coming to you live next Tuesday as well. We're doing a Azure governance, taking a look at our AMS solution spotlight there. So our AMS tool will be taking a special look at that with Clint Adkins and Robert Lovelace will be joining us for that one. And then we also have one on an out of band one. So out of our usual Tuesday cadence, we will have another one around Azure cost optimization, and Chris, you'll be joining me for that one on Thursday. So we actually have two webinars for the upcoming week. So plenty of opportunities there. And of course, as mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, we'll be doing those through Microsoft or Teams live events. So looking forward to that. All right. As Chris said, thank you everybody who tuned in today. And for those of you who are watching on demand, we really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll see you during the next episode of Tech Tuesdays.
Thanks, everybody.